February 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army throw the British out of Malaya and Singapore and begin an occupation that will last nearly 4 years.
December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. At the same time, they also landed on Kota Bharu and conducted air raids on Singapore. On the 10th of December, without the support of RAF fighters, the only two British warships in the Far East, the HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales, were easily sunk. The Japanese wanted to seize Malaya to build a new empire that they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. On the 31st of January 1942, Malaya fell from the Japanese. The British retreated to Singapore and blew up the causeway. The Japanese sailed to Singapore using rubber boats and rafts. On the 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell from the Japanese. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrenders unconditionally to the Japanese at Old Fort Motor Factory. The different races in Singapore, the Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Eurasians, will experience the occupation in sharply different ways. In this episode, we will look at how the Chinese were treated during the Japanese occupation. Japan has been at war with China since 1937. The Japanese knew that many people in Singapore supported the Chinese. Hence, a few days after the British surrender, General Yamashita orders the Kempeitai to carry out Operation Suqing, which means cleansing by purification, in practice, meaning mass murder. It aimed to identify and eliminate anti-Japanese elements among the Chinese. Chinese men aged between 18 to 50 had to report to examination areas to be examined. Men suspected of being anti-Japanese were being made to march to places like Changi Beach for execution. Those who tried to escape would have been shot, then stabbed. The mass murder begins at Changi Beach. The Japanese guns down the Chinese men. As they were being gunned down, some fatally shot men collapsed on others who were not fatally shot, and these men below the dead bodies would miraculously survive the brutal execution. The Japanese would then proceed to stab the body or bodies on top, and not the one below, so this man would survive. In this episode, we will look at how the Malays were treated during the Japanese occupation. Welcome, Malay friend.
Nice to meet you.
Indeed. So you are here to sign the alliance with the Japanese people, with the people of the Malays. Do you agree to sign this? Now it's my turn. On behalf of the Japanese people,
I look forward to our great partnership.
me too. The people will benefit very much from this allegiance.
Thank you. See you again.
In this episode, we will look at how the Indians were treated during the Japanese occupation. Just like the Malays, the Indians were not totally spared. When they committed crimes, they would be punished. An example of these punishments was beheading. Their decapitated heads will be placed on metal plates in town for everyone to see.
Oh, you down! You down! I will kill you.
Gonna back! Why is he in court? Baratayagan!
He stole my drink.
He stole it.
Gonna go again.
One for this man.
Da.
You heard the man, give him death.
Do. Spando. Do. Oh.
Stab him.
Oh.
Once more. Even though they mostly targeted rich Indians, the other races were also not spared, as waters sold in Japan were very expensive at that time. When the Japanese invaded Singapore, the soldiers took or confiscated watches from most of the civilians simply because these watches were either expensive or looked appealing to the Japanese soldiers patrolling the streets at that period of time. It is no wonder that the Japanese soldiers had at least 3 watches on both their wrists by the time they returned to their headquarters. In this episode, we will look at how the Eurasians were treated during the Japanese occupation. When the Japanese conquered Singapore, one of the races most affected by the Japanese occupation is the Eurasians. Many Eurasians became prisoners of war during the Japanese occupation. The Japanese denied them the human rights and necessities which they deserved as prisoners of war, and they were even tortured or shot, as the Japanese felt that the prisoners of war should be beheaded or castrated at the will of their emperor, and also for the fact that some of these Eurasians helped fight against the Japanese in the Singapore Volunteer Corps. In this episode, we will look at the common experiences that all the races faced during the Japanese occupation. The Japanese took most of the food for themselves and rationed the remaining food. Food rationing cards were introduced. The food given out was so meager that some people had to trade their valuables for slightly more food. Some people took advantage of the situation to get more food. Hence a black market emerged where people sold goods at higher prices.